Hey, hockey card fans, welcome back to Hockey Night in Belmont. Made a trip all the way to St.Jacobs because my wife was meeting her cousin there and they wanted to go to the market, of all things. It's like a halfway point. So we went down to St.Jacobs market, farmer's market, and we decided to hit the antique market as well. And I've picked up 13 hockey cards from 4 different sets. It was a Black Friday sale, so they had 20% off cards. I wish I had more money at the time. But anyway, let's take a look. So, I got the first card I have is from the 1970 O-Pee-Chee set. This is 69-70. So this is when the Boston Bruins had won their first Stanley Cup. And we have right winger LA Kings Larry Mickey. This card is in pretty good shape. Paid $4 for it. And then 20% off these things. I really don't know much about him, other than the fact, but he started his career with the Chicago Blackhawks, went to the New York Rangers, then went to the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Montreal Canadiens, then he was with the LA Kings briefly. That was his only season there. Then he went to the Philadelphia Flyers and then spent parts of 4 seasons with the Buffalo Sabres. So he only played 292 games, 39 goals, 92 points, 9 playoff games, 1 goal. He was claimed in the interleague draft by the Toronto Maple Leafs from New York Rangers in 1968. 1969, he was claimed in the interleague draft by Montreal Canadiens from Toronto Maple Leafs. And then traded from Philadelphia Flyers to Buffalo Sabres for Larry Keenan. So not exactly a... People wanted him, but he never really panned out as a player. Considering that when he was playing with the Moose Jaw Canucks, he scored 69 goals, 73 assists for 142 points. But that's in the Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League. Never translated to the NHL. His best season, from what I can tell, was with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Won 55 games, he had 8 goals, 19 assists for 27 points. Hey, at least he got the NHL. He has 3 cards, and this is his second year card. Next, we're going with Chicago Blackhawks defenseman Pat Stapleton. I have several of his cards. This is also $5, minus that 20%. All these are minus 20%, so. But with taxes, that basically means 7% off. He was an all-star defenseman. Started his career with Boston. But he'd actually been in the Chicago Blackhawks system, so Boston picked him up, and then Chicago got him back. And he played 8 seasons with the Chicago Blackhawks before moving to the WHA. Played with the Chicago Cougars, the Indianapolis Racers, and the Cincinnati Stingers. I have his hockey card when he played for Chicago Cougars. He was also a player head coach for 2 seasons with the Cougars and was a head coach of the Indianapolis Racers in their final season. So he coached Wayne Gretzky. So he's claimed in the interleague draft by Boston Bruins from Chicago in 1961. And then traded from Boston Bruins with Andy Hebington and Orland Kurtenbach to Toronto Maple Leafs for Ron Stewart. Obviously didn't stay with them because he went to Chicago. So he was in the minors in 65, playing for the St. Louis Braves after winning a Western Hockey League title with the Portland Buckaroos. So I don't know how Chicago got him. Pretty good player, never won a Stanley Cup or even a Avco trophy, but he was an all-star defenseman. Going from one defenseman to the other, we have Montreal Canadiens defenseman Terry Harper. These cards are in pretty good shape. Can't complain there. Terry Harper won 5 Stanley Cups with the Montreal Canadiens. Then got traded to the LA Kings. Spent 3 years there. Went to the Detroit Red Wings for 4 years. St. Louis Blues and Colorado Rockies. Just as a spot player. 1,066 games, 35 goals, 256 points, over 1,300 penalty minutes. And then 112 playoff games, 4 goals, 13 assists for 17 points. Him and J.C. Tremblay were the 2 guys in Montreal who are not known for their goal scoring prowess. And he also had a plus-minus of 169, which did not become an official stat until his 6th season in 1967-68, so it's probably better than that. He is not in the Hall of Fame. I always thought he was, but he was an excellent defenseman. So in 1975, June, he got traded from the LA Kings with Dan Maloney and round 2 pick in the 76th draft to Detroit Red Wings for the rights to Marcel Dion and Bart Crashley. And then in March 10, 1980, he was signed by St. Louis to help in their playoff push. So Detroit made a dumb trade. Like, Harper's a good player, a good defenseman, but he's not Marcel Dion. And then the Jim Roberts they're talking about is the one, he didn't pan out either. Bart Crashley had played for the Islanders, I know that. Again, Marcel Dion didn't want it out of Detroit, and that was the only way to get him. They could have got more for him, I think. Then we go to St. Louis Blues defenseman, the other Jim Roberts. I just said Jim Roberts got traded, was a round 2 pick in the 76th draft. This is the other Jim Roberts, the one, an assistant with the Blues. Not exactly an uncommon name. The one we're talking about here had won 5 Stanley Cups with the Montreal Canadiens. 2 in the mid-60s, 65 and 66. Then he won 1 in Montreal in 73, and then won 2 more in 76 and 77. Played 4 seasons with Montreal Canadiens, then went to the St. Louis Blues for 5 seasons, or 4.5 seasons, then went back to Montreal, where he played another 5.5 seasons before going back to St. Louis in 77 for 1 final season. So he was claimed in the expansion draft by St. Louis from Montreal, and then traded from St. Louis Blues to Montreal Canadiens for Phil Roberto in 71. So they traded him back. Jim Roberts was paired with Bob Gainey and Doug Jarvis to form the checking line. That was his role. He was a shutdown guy. He was a defenseman, but then he played wing later in his career. All right, moving on to another Montreal Canadian, right winger Claude LaRose. This is another guy making his return to the Montreal Canadiens. He won 3 Stanley Cups with Montreal in 65, 66, and 68. Then went to the Minnesota North Stars for 2 seasons. Went back to Montreal, which is this year. And he won 2 more Stanley Cups in 71, 73 before going to the St. Louis Blues in 74, 75. So he was traded from Montreal Canadiens with Danny Grant to Minnesota for future considerations, which turned out to be a round 1 pick in 72, which is Dave Gardner and cash. I think they should have kept both Danny Grant and him, but Montreal was so deep back then, these guys weren't getting played. Then he was traded from Minnesota to Montreal for Bobby Rousseau. And then traded from Montreal to St. Louis for future considerations and cash. Signed by the Birmingham Bulls but never played. Interesting player. 943 games, 226 goals, 483 assists. 97 playoff games, 14 goals, 18 assists for 32 points. Not shabby. He was a third-line guy in the Montreal Canadiens. Probably a second-line guy in the Minnesota North Stars. All right, next up we have from the Boston Bruins defenseman, Ted Green. I forgot to mention that from Pat Stapleton, Harper, Roberts, and LaRose, and now Green, these are all from the 1970-71. These are all from the 71 O-Pee-Chee set. So when Montreal Canadiens beat Chicago in 7 games in the playoffs, when Ken Dryden as a rookie came out of nowhere. And these are what they call the Portrait Series. The one with Larry Mickey is called the Movie Star because of the little light spots. Forgot to mention that. Ted Green has played his entire career in the NHL with the Boston Bruins. He missed the 1969-70 season due to an injury. So he missed Boston's first Stanley Cup, but he would win a Stanley Cup in 71-72 with Boston. Then won 3 Avco trophies with the New England Whalers, and then 2 with the Winnipeg Jets. Spent 7 years in the WHA. He head coached the Edmonton Oilers for 2.5 seasons. Went to the semifinals 1 year, but then couldn't get them over the hump. This is when the Edmonton Oilers their dynasty had faded. As an assistant coach, he won some Stanley Cups with the Edmonton Oilers. 90-91, he was a co-coach, lost in round 3. His head coaching career, he was lost in round 3 again, and then out of the playoffs. Edmonton was going through that phase, though, where their dynasty years were done. And despite having all those draft picks, they never really rebuilt after the Gretzky trade. Now we have Toronto Maple Leafs left winger and rookie card, Denis Duperrey. Paid $2 for this card. It's not in the greatest shape, but he's not exactly a well-known guy. He spent 4 seasons in Toronto before going in the expansion draft to the Washington Capitals in '74. Then was traded halfway through to the St. Louis Blues. Then went back to the Kansas City Scouts in 75-76, and stayed with them until 77-78. I have several of his cards when he's with the Rockies and the Scouts. So he was traded from the Washington Capitals to St. Louis Blues for Garnet, Ace Bailey, and Stan Gilbertson. I would say Washington did good on that trade. Duperrey was not exactly a goal scorer. His best season was with Washington when he had 20 goals, 15 assists for 35 points in 53 games. Ended his career with 421 games, 80 goals, 179 points, 16 playoff games, 1 goal. So not exactly a big name guy. Then we're going with Chicago Blackhawks right winger, Ron Chico Mackey. Chico was his nickname. He had a brother, Wayne, I believe, playing. He won a Stanley Cup with Chicago Blackhawks despite not playing a game in the regular season and playing 1 playoff game. He got his name on the cup. He then spent the rest of his career with Chicago. 841 regular season games, 143 goals, 436 points, 113 playoff games, 17 goals, 53 points. Contributed in the playoffs a lot. He'd be a second, third line guy. Then we have left winger, Vancouver Canucks, Dave Ballon. I only paid $2 for this card. It's still in fairly good shape considering. The head doesn't look right on the body. It might, for all I know, it's been photoshopped, like cut and paste. He did win 2 Stanley Cups with Montreal. I do have another one. I do have one of his cards when he played for the Rangers, I believe, that I picked up. And I have some of his cards when he played for the Canucks. Played 776 NHL games, 192 goals, 414 points, 78 playoff games, 14 goals, 35 assists, or 35 points. It's not bad. The 2 Stanley Cups stick out. With the Rangers, he actually was a pretty good player. 33 goals, 36 goals. Then got injured. And then went sent to Vancouver in 71-72. So did play 9 games with the Quebec Nordiques, but never stayed. So he's claimed the expansion draft by Minnesota North Stars from Montreal Canadiens. So he went from the Rangers to Montreal, won 2 cups, then went to Minnesota in expansion. Played 1 year in Minnesota, then went to the Rangers again, and then finally the Vancouver Canucks, where he was traded from New York Rangers with Wayne Conley and Ron Stewart to Vancouver for Gary Doak and Jim Wist. That's an odd trade. I would almost have to say that the Vancouver Canucks won that deal, because Jim Wist went on and played with the Gary Doak went on to play with Boston, or went back to play with Boston. Jim Wist, he went right to the WHA, didn't even play with the Rangers. So I have his card when he was in Indianapolis with the Racers. So that's all the ones from the 1971 O-Pee-Chee set, the Portrait Series. Next we're going to go with the 1973 O-Pee-Chee set. So this is a 72-73 stat year. This is when Montreal won another Stanley Cup. Guy Lafleur's first Stanley Cup. And I have Chicago Blackhawks center Stan Mikita. Paid $2 for this card. It's a little dinged on it. Mikita, of course, is in the Hockey Hall of Fame. He won a Stanley Cup in 1960-61 with Chicago. Spent his entire career with the Chicago Blackhawks. Played almost 1,400 games. 541 goals, 1,467 points. And then in 155 playoff games, he scored 59 goals, 91 assists for 150 points. So he was over a point a game in the NHL in the regular season, and then almost the same in the playoffs. Played right up until 79-80. Hell of a player. Chicago had a good team in the 60s, but could never get past Montreal, it seemed, or Toronto. They only won that 1 cup with him and Bobby Hull. This set is interesting because the first 132 cards are red bordered, and the next 132 are green bordered. And the top series has blue and yellow on top of that. All right, moving along, we got the 72-73 goals against average leaders. Ken Dryden was the Eastern leader, and Tony Esposito of the Blackhawks was the Western leader. Tony Esposito was in the Montreal system. So this is kind of cool. Ken Dryden had a 226 goals against average. Gilles Lemieux Rangers had a 229 goals against average. Michel Plessis of the Montreal Canadiens had a 258. Roy Edwards, Detroit, had a 263. Ross Brooks, Boston, had a 264. Dave Dryden, Buffalo, had 265. Roger Crozier, Buffalo Sabres, 276. Ed Giacomin had a 291. Jacques Plante, Toronto, had a 304. And Ed Johnson, Boston, had a 327. That's the East. In the West, Esposito was a 251. Doug Flavelle of the Flyers was 283. Rogie Vachon was a 285 of the Kings. Cesar Maniago of the Minnesota North Stars was a 289. And Jim Rutherford, Pittsburgh, had a 291 goals against average. The other guys are all threes. So even though looking at the pads and that, it's just because of the way the rules were. There wasn't a lot of rules back in those days. Even though goalies had terrible equipment that you couldn't really slide. That's why you don't see a lot of butterfly goalies in the NHL in the 70s, because the padding just didn't work that way. Instead, you had to be more acrobatic. And there was more hooking and sticking, and there's no two-line rule. There's a two-line rule, so you can't do two-line passes. And the offensive zone was a lot smaller. But goalies were better in the 70s than they were in the 80s. Dryden and Esposito and Bernie Parent were and you can see what I mean with the green border. And then we have a goaltender for the LA Kings, Gary Edwards. Paid $2 for this card. It is his second-year card, or his third-year card, sorry. Despite only he played 2 games for St. Louis between 1968 and 70. He gets a card for one of them. Then in 70-71, he played 44 games for the Kings. Then the Kings got Vachon, and he didn't play as much. Went from the LA Kings to the Cleveland Barons, who then became the Minnesota North Stars. He was one of the goalies who shut down Montreal's bid for 5 straight when the Minnesota North Stars beat Montreal in 7 games in the quarterfinals of the 79-80 playoffs. Played 15 games for Edmonton in 81. 10 more games for St. Louis in 81-82, and then 6 games for Pittsburgh in 81-82. I have his last card when he played for Minnesota. That's his final card. And of course I have his cards with Cleveland and Los Angeles. He was drafted by the St. Louis Blues in 1968, round 1, 6th overall. Highly respected. Claimed an expansion draft by Buffalo from St. Louis. Then claimed in the interleague draft by LA Kings from Buffalo Sabres, because he never played for the Sabres. He was down in the Western Hockey League, or the CH in the Colonial Central Hockey League. Then he was traded from LA Kings with Juha Whiting to Cleveland Barons from Jim Moxey and Gary Simmons. I would say Cleveland won that deal. And then claimed off waivers from St. Louis by St. Louis from Edmonton, then claimed off waivers by Pittsburgh from St. Louis. So doesn't say how he got away from Buffalo. But he played 287 NHL games. He had 10 shutouts in his career, and was a .365 goals against average. 88, 125, and 51 were his win-loss tie record. Didn't play for very good teams. This year in question, he had a 3.62 goals against average, 1 shutout. He was 9 wins, 16 losses, and a tie. Career-wise, he was a .879 save percentage. So, not a great goalie, but a serviceable one. Played on some pretty bad teams, especially in Cleveland and Minnesota. Alright, moving on to the last card here. This is from the 1975 O-Pee-Chee set, so 74-75 stat year. It's also the second Stanley Cup of the Philadelphia Flyers. And it's Toronto Maple Leafs right winger Lanny McDonald. Before he had the very famous stash. His stash was just starting to grow. This was probably the best pick Toronto made after Sittler. He was drafted in the first round, 4th overall in the 1973 amateur draft. Islanders had picked up Dennis Potvin. Atlanta picked up Tom Lysiak, who was a really good player. Vancouver had picked up Dennis Ververget, who wasn't quite as good. Lanny's in the Hall of Fame. Tom Lysiak had a good career, but not as great as Lanny McDonald. Then he was drafted by the Cleveland Crusaders, round 1, 10th overall in the same 73 draft, but never played in the AW. Played 6.5 seasons with Toronto Maple Leafs before being infamously traded to the Colorado Rockies. So Lanny McDonald then played basically 142 games with the Colorado Rockies over parts of 3 seasons. He had like 35 goals, 46 assists for 81 points with Colorado in 80-81. I don't know why they didn't keep him. Then he went to the Calgary Flames, and that's when he had his best season, when he had 66 goals, 32 assists for 98 points. He had hit the 40-goal mark 3 straight seasons in Toronto, 46, 47, 43, between 1977 and 79. I don't know why Toronto. Well, I know why. Herb Ballard was an ass who tried to split the team up. He had a good team and split them up. Went to one Stanley Cup final with Calgary in 86, where they lost to Montreal. But then he beat Montreal in 88-89. He'd played 51 games, had 11 goals, 18 points. But then in 14 playoff games, he had 4 points, while goal and 3 assists. But career-wise, 1,111 games, 1-1-1-1, 500 goals, 506 assists for 1,006 points, 899 penalty minutes. So in 117 playoff games, he had 44 goals and 40 assists for 84 points. Hall of Famer. Excellent guy. Never heard anything bad about him. So he was traded from Toronto Maple Leafs with Joel Quenneville to Colorado Rockies for Pat Hickey and Wolf Paymont. Paymont was a solid player. Pat Hickey was a good player too. But I don't like the deal for Toronto. Quenneville was a serviceable defenseman. That's about it. Then he was traded from Colorado Rockies on November 25th, 1981 to Calgary Flames for Donnie Lever and Bob McMillan. 2 guys who were consistent. Don Lever was a consistent 20-goal scorer, so was Bob McMillan. But they were not Lanny McDonald. So why Colorado made that deal, I don't know. But Calgary, he had a 40-goal season in 81-82, like 6 goals in Colorado, then 34 goals in Calgary. 66 goals in Calgary, 33 goals in Calgary, and then he started declining. Injuries took their toll. He had 6 plus 40-goal seasons. Never hit the 100-point plateau. Won the Bill Master in 81-82 and 82-83 for perseverance, coming back from injury. Then he won the King Clancy in 87-88 to go along with the Stanley Cup. So, great player. So there we have it. 13 cards, 4 different sets. We paid like $30 for all these cards. I can't. Maybe less with that discount. But all you hockey card fans out there, let me know, what do you guys think? Should Toronto have traded him? And should Colorado have gotten more for him? Like, what do you think of the trade deals for Lanny McDonald? Do you think Toronto could have gotten more for him? Because Wolf Paymont was a good player. And should Colorado have made a better deal trading Lanny McDonald? Leave comments in the comment section. Until next time, this has been Hockey Night in Belmont.